Follow the conversation. This is Afternoons on the Dove.
Welcome to Afternoons on the Dove. I'm your host, Perry Atkinson, and today I'm telling you we have a real treat for you. We're going to take a step back in history, and I want to encourage you to really get a hold of this program and share it with your friends. If you're watching on the Dove TV right now, we're going to rebroadcast this again tonight at 6 and at 10:30. And if you're listening on the Dove Radio, we'll be rebroadcasting it again this afternoon at 5 o'clock. And then later on, it'll be available for you on the Dove website at theDove.us, where you'll be able to share it with your friends, and especially if you have some veterans in your family. I am delighted and honored to have with us today Scott McGaugh. He is the award-winning author and veteran journalist. He's an authority on naval history from the end of World War II through Operation Desert Storm. His interests and expertise in naval aircraft carrier, the USS Midway, serves as an inspiration to the many books that he has published. Perhaps you have seen Scott on some of the programs on television, from the History Channel to the Travel Channel, Discovery Channel on Fox News. He's marketing director for the USS Midway Museum, and he makes his many monthly public speeches aboard the museum. In fact, today, Scott is with us aboard the USS Midway, which is now in San Diego, and he is on board the ship, and I'll let him describe to you in a few moments exactly where he is on board the ship. But he also has authored this book, and I want to put this up for our viewers and listeners. Make sure you get a copy of this, put up by Pelican Publication. There it is on the screen if you're seeing it. USS Midway, America's Shield, Young Heroes at Sea. And let me encourage you to get a copy of this book. I started reading it, and I got to stay up past my bedtime to finish it. Scott, what a delight and an honor to have you with us, sir.
Well, Perry, thank you very much. It is a real pleasure to share what really is amazing living history, a legacy in many, many ways. And I think it's something that we civilians need to be mindful of. It's really a remarkable story, and it continues today.
Well, let me also say to our listeners and viewers that Scott has some connections to the Rogue Valley. He has some family right here in Medford and Central Point, so he's certainly no stranger to the area. Well, first of all, Scott, let me ask you this. Where did you become interested in naval history and naval aviation?
Well, Perry, I kind of backed into it, to be honest with you. I'm a native of San Diego, and shortly after Midway was decommissioned in 1992, there became an effort here in San Diego to bring Midway back to become a museum. We are the birthplace of naval aviation. We didn't have any kind of memorial or museum in tribute to that. I thought it was a great idea to bring Midway here. I started volunteering in 1996 to do the public relations to bring Midway to San Diego. It was a real privilege. I volunteered for 8 years. Then they asked me to become the marketing director. So in the course of the last 14, 15 years, I've really come to appreciate those who serve our country in uniform. I didn't have to during Vietnam, during the lottery. So it's really become a passion of preserving that legacy, sharing the stories, the heroism, the courage, the compassion of those who serve our country in all uniforms. And as I say, I kind of backed into what has become the most rewarding part of my life.
I can't imagine the job that you have, and yet what an honor and what you are doing in preserving such an incredible piece of history. And you know, when I first started reading your book, Scott, the first thing that it uncorked in my mind was I don't think any of us in civilian life have any idea what's going on board these ships. I don't think we have the foggiest idea of the life, the culture, let alone the history. And I only read about a chapter and a half, and I'm going, oh man, I just didn't know.
Well, yes, you asked, Perry, about 4 questions in that, and it's a reaction a lot of people have. We're the most visited floating ship museum in the world, 900,000 visitors a year, and I would suspect that probably 95 to 99% of those who come aboard from Boone, Iowa, and Medford and Central Point have exactly the same reaction. You know, Midway is a great example of what a lot of people don't realize. This was a ship that was commissioned 1 week after the end of World War II. It was a flagship of naval air operations in Desert Storm in 1991. It sailed through the cross currents of almost every international crisis in that time: Korea, Vietnam, showdowns with Chairman Mao, Cuban Missile Crisis, Iranian hostage crisis, Desert Storm. And that was an odyssey shared by 200,000 Americans who served on this ship. Their average age was only 19.
Wow.
They lived aboard a floating city at sea, which we can get into a little bit, perhaps, if you like. That really is a unique environment. But I think something that really surprises people, that of a crew of 4,500, only about 5% were pilots. And that's where they make the movies with Tom Cruise and Top Gun and so on. But it's those other 95% who are bakers and cobblers and butchers and electricians and welders and corpsmen and dentists and postal clerks and jail guards. Everything in a small town was aboard Midway, so 5% could fly, 5% could answer their nation's call over the course of 47 years, the longest serving carrier of the 20th century.
Wow. Where are you in the ship right now? Tell our listeners and viewers, where are you? You're on the Midway, but where are you in the ship?
I am just above the hangar deck, which is the large deck that some of your listeners and viewers may understand or recognize as the large deck where they store some of the planes. There are actually two smaller decks between the hangar deck and the flight deck. I'm on the 01 level, which is one level up from the hangar deck. So about 10 feet above me is where 40,000-pound jets were landing at 150 miles an hour inside the dimensions of a tennis court. So I'm not too far from what we colloquially call the roof, the 4-acre flight deck, solid steel flight deck in Midway's case.
All right. Well, I'm sure you got a lot of stories. Let's just give you take a few moments and give us some dimensions and maybe some more statistics on that incredible vessel. Of course, it's decommissioned now, but give us some dimensions on that, and in comparison to the new carriers that are now in service.
You bet. When Midway was commissioned, or when it was decommissioned, it's 1,000 feet, 1,001 feet, 6 inches long, 258 feet wide at its widest point, 70,000 tons, 2,000 rooms, solid steel, and it went fast enough that you could water ski behind Midway at a top speed of about 40 miles an hour. It was the largest ship in the world for a decade, until 1955. And many people here in San Diego, when they look out across the bay from Midway, they see active duty carriers home ported in San Diego, such as the USS Ronald Reagan. In many ways, they are different. In some ways they aren't. For example, the Reagan is only about 150 feet longer. The basic footprint of a carrier with the angled flight deck and so on hasn't changed much. Midway at 70,000 tons displacement, the Reagan a little north of 100,000 tons. So in terms of bulk and technology, of course, and so on, completely different. Inside, it's an all-new world compared to Midway. Midway consumed 100,000 gallons of fuel a day. The Reagan is nuclear powered. 4,500 men, teenagers on Midway, 6,000 men and women on the Reagan, approximately. The air wing is still about the same. Roughly 5% of any aircraft carrier are pilots. That hasn't changed. It's the other 95% who are doing jobs below decks 7 days a week, 6 months straight at sea. So that 5-6% can fly. So there are a lot of commonalities between what Midway retired as with the common carrier, or the active duty carrier of today, not counting, of course, technology.
Unbelievable. How did it get its name?
It was named for the Battle of Midway. As is often the case, Navy ships construction begins without a name. And at some point during the process, either the Secretary of the Navy, Secretary of Defense, Chief of Naval Operations, depending upon the era, will decide on a name. And as you think about it, we've gone through different phases of naming carriers after presidents, the Reagan, for example, or after famous battles or other accomplishments. Midway was named for the Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway by 1944 had been recognized as the turning point in the war in the Pacific. This ship was being built in a race to get it into the war because it dwarfed anything afloat. And it became a PR decision, frankly, that they wanted to commemorate the Battle of Midway, remember the Battle of Midway, support the war effort, buy war bonds, support the USS Midway when it's commissioned in 1945.
All right. So when did it first see action?
It hit the water 1 week after the end of World War II. It was built in only 17 months around the clock after 5 years of hand-drawn blueprints,
Wow.
But missed the war by 1 week. And so it was commissioned September 10th, 1945. Very famous speech by the initial commanding officer on the flight deck said that for some of us senior officers, we so look forward to teaching the Japanese a lesson, but it falls to us to preserve the world's peace. And that's what Midway did. Midway was the only carrier to sail the entire length of the Cold War and beyond over those 47 years. And yet, surprisingly, to some way of thinking, only spent about 10% of its active life in combat, Vietnam and Desert Storm. And that's about typical. Most carriers will spend about 10-15% of their lives in open combat, depending upon the era, because a carrier's primary role is one of not only perseverance, but deterrence. You know, you see in the movies, it doesn't last during a crisis. Where's the nearest carrier battle group? Get it into an area of instability, uncertainty, give those enemies a moment of pause to create an opportunity to stabilize things. And that's the role of an aircraft carrier, of naval aviation, from the beginning of time.
So how many aircraft could it handle?
Well, it depends on the era. Think about the differences in naval aviation from 1945 to Desert Storm, from TBM dive bombers of the Battle of Midway era to Hornets and Tomcats in Desert Storm. So when Midway was commissioned, it had the largest air wing in the world, approximately 138 aircraft, much smaller World War II planes. And by Desert Storm, it was on the order of about 60 in terms of much larger, far more sophisticated, far more powerful aircraft with all the avionics and technology that went with it. So the short answer is it changed from decade to decade as naval aviation evolved and advanced.
And that obviously changed the actual flight deck itself. I mean, the aircraft required different equipment to get it on and off.
Absolutely. Midway had to reflect all of that. Midway was the first carrier in the world built for nuclear weapons, nuclear weapon carrying aircraft. 8 of the first 90 nuclear weapons this country built were aboard Midway by the late 1940s. Then as the jet era came on, the development of that second short angle deck for jets to land on, that had to be added in the mid-1950s. And then in the late 1960s, Midway was decommissioned for about 4 years for a major overhaul. And it was always to add, retrofit new technology, more sophisticated technology over the course of the years.
We're talking to Scott McGaugh. He is author of the USS Midway, the book called America's Shield. He's also marketing director for the USS Midway Museum in San Diego, California. We're actually talking to him today from aboard the USS Midway, and a fascinating book and history and so much here to talk about. So we'd look forward to maybe you'd like to join the question or ask any questions. You're welcome to do that by calling us at 776-5368. Scott, before we take a break, was Midway ever used for any astronaut recovery?
No, it wasn't. Because it was one of the leading aircraft carriers in its class during the Cold War, and because of its armament capability, it really sailed at what was called the point of the spear in terms of dealing with the Russians in different sensitive areas around the world. So typically it was older carriers that weren't as technologically advanced that were used primarily for the Apollo and Gemini recovery missions in the Pacific that we all saw on the news back in the 60s and perhaps the early 70s.
All right, let me take a quick break. We'll be right back. If you would like to join us, you're welcome to. The number is 776-5368. There's so much history here. It's incredible. I hope you get a chance to visit the USS Midway in San Diego. Get this book. It's a piece of history, and share it with your friends. We'll take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
Follow the conversation. This is Afternoon on the Dove. Follow the conversation. This is Afternoon on the Dove.
Well, we are really honored to have with us today author and veteran journalist Scott McGaugh. He is also the marketing director for the USS Midway Museum in San Diego, California. And if you're watching on the Dove TV, we are Skyping him in from the USS Midway Museum, the actual ship itself, and what a delight to have him with us today. We're learning so much. He's authored this book called The USS Midway, America's Shield, Young Heroes at Sea. And I started reading this book, and I'm telling you, I'm fascinated by it. It just opened up my mind to so many things that I think that we have forgotten and taken for granted. And I apologize to our veterans for that, because there's just so much history here. Let me encourage you to get a copy of this book and then share this program with your friends. It'll be rebroadcast tonight at 6 and 10:30 on the Dove TV, at 5 o'clock on the Dove Radio, and it should be up on YouTube at the Dove website coming up in about an hour and a half. Scott, so many fascinating things here about this ship, and do you think we could possibly make another aircraft carrier in 17 months in today's world?
No, I don't think there's a chance, Perry. Just from the technology alone, it takes years and years and years to design a carrier. The Gerald Ford, now in construction, has been in the works for, I think, 8 years. And that was, I think, about the length of time or close to it that it took to design and build the Ronald Reagan, USS Ronald Reagan. So just from technology alone, the idea of building a ship like this in 17 months, I think, is something in the past, particularly when you consider in Midway's case that it took 5 years of draftsmen hand drawing the blueprints using nothing more than a slide rule, because this ship was built and designed before computers were invented. So there were no CAD drawings, computer simulations, if you will. It was all done the old-fashioned way through a whole lot of hard work and what was called the maximum war effort back in the 1940s.
Do you think that the Midway is so incredible and so much history here? Let me ask you this. You also contribute your book to a lot of the heroes on board, and I'm sure you got a lot of stories to share with us today. And I want you to take a few moments and share with us some of those stories. With 100, did I hear you say it burned 100,000 gallons of fuel a day?
Depending upon the sea state and flight ops and so on, what was going on, yes, the fuel consumption was about 100,000 gallons a day.
So, how many times did it have to go to port and refuel?
It didn't. That's another aspect that people are just fascinated by, and that is something called UNREPs, underway replenishments. When Midway was homeported in Yokosuka, Japan, the first carrier homeported abroad, went into the Indian Ocean or the Persian Gulf on a 6-month deployment, there were supply ships pulling up alongside Midway in the middle of the ocean, slowing down about 10 knots, 150 feet apart, shooting lines across, staying tethered no matter the sea state for hours at a time, resupplying some portion of what a city at sea, population 4,500, consumes, from X-ray film to newsprint, typewriter ribbon, fuel, food, detergent, parts, paper, newsprint for the ship's newspaper, all those kinds of things. And that was taking place about every 3 or 4 days for 6, 7, 8 months at a time during a deployment. So when you look at it, Perry, from a different perspective, there were thousands of supply officers, purchasing agents, supply ships, all working for Midway's battle group, when Midway came through the neighborhood, so to speak, right, supporting Midway and its group of ships that was protecting Midway. All those men working to protect Midway and its crew working so that 200 or 300 pilots could take to the air.
Wow.
It's just remarkable the amount of teamwork, the trust, the coordination, the planning, the dedication, I believe, that is necessary for any deployment to take place. And fundamentally, that hasn't changed. When you see or hear about a battle group, carrier group returning to port somewhere in the United States today, essentially that same process has taken place for months at a time in the middle of the ocean, out of sight from the rest of us.
All right, Scott, I got an interesting call coming in, a gentleman by the name of Bob who was on the sister ship. And Bob, hi, you're on the air with Scott McGaugh.
Hey, Perry, thanks. Yeah, I was on the Coral Sea, CV-43, which is the sister ship to the Midway.
Yes.
Just fascinating time. I know exactly what you're talking about as far as what's needed on the ship. I first got on the ship when it was in dry dock in Norfolk, Virginia, and we were doing a total rehab retrofit for the Hornets.
Yep.
And just a fascinating thing. Unfortunately, that ship was totally dismantled, not saved for museum purposes, but.
Yes, Bob, it's unfortunate, but there's so many great Navy ships in our history who represent tremendous history and a legacy of service that unfortunately can't be preserved. There's only so many ways and so many opportunities for that. The Midway was, as you know, the lead ship of the Midway class, followed within 6 months by the Coral Sea and the FDR. It was a revolutionary class of aircraft carrier that really pioneered naval aviation into the jet age, into the nuclear age. And the Coral Sea and the FDR both served 25, 30 years, but there wasn't another home for them, so they were scrapped. Unfortunately, Midway is still here to represent not just Midway, but the Midway class, including the Coral Sea.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, good stuff. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks.
Okay. Hey, Scott, what does the term sister ship mean?
It's a loose term. Basically, there's a class of ships, the Nimitz class of carriers. It's the first carrier of a new class of carriers or ships. Usually it's much larger, more sophisticated, the latest model, like a car, if you will. And then a number of other ships are built to those same specifications for that class. So there was the Essex class of aircraft carrier in World War II, the Essex being the first. Then the Midway class. Followed by the Coral Sea and FDR in that class. Then the next generation was the Forrestal in 1955, then the Nimitz, and so on. So it's basically a class of carrier or a class of ship that replaces an older model from one perspective.
All right, we got another call coming in. Hi, Abigail. You're on the air with Scott McGaugh. Go ahead.
Okay, I was wondering if any other countries in the world have a carrier that's on par with Midway, and if so, when?
You mean as a museum or active duty?
You mean as an active duty or a museum?
I mean on active duty.
Well, yes. You know, Midway was well, let me re-answer that, rephrase that. When Midway was commissioned, it was the largest and most sophisticated ship in the world, and was for a decade, into the mid-1950s. As we developed more aircraft carriers, the Forrestal class was more sophisticated and larger, and the Nimitz and so on. But when it comes to the world, the United States has always led the world in naval aviation, in the development of aircraft carrier capability. No country has ever had the number of carriers that we do, nor has a country had a more sophisticated or capable aircraft carrier than the United States has had at any given time. So we have been the leaders from that perspective, although some of the design innovations for all carriers frequently have been developed by the British.
All right. Thank you, Abigail. Great work. If you have any questions for Scott, you're welcome to join us, 776-5368. Fascinating. Hey, Scott, how long was the average deployment?
Oh, it ranged, Perry, anywhere from 4 months to 6 or 7 months, I would think, over the 47 years. Although the last time I looked it up, Midway still held the record for carriers for the longest deployment in the mid-1970s, 327 days at sea. That's about 11 months for a 19-year-old to be away from home for the first time in an era where you got mail once or twice a week if you were lucky by plane. Unlike today's sailors and soldiers who have email accounts and can even watch their children being born at home via the internet, it was a very different world back then when you were gone for 6 or 7, 8, 9 months at a time.
Did the Midway ever see action from the standpoint where it got hit and was damaged?
No. The last time any American carrier took enemy fire directly like that to any degree was World War II. Korea was a ground war. Vietnam fundamentally was a ground war. Certainly there were some small enemy vessels off the coast of Vietnam that other ships, other Navy ships were on the alert for, but no carrier has taken direct enemy fire, American carrier, since World War II.
Where do we start with the stories of the men and the crew? I mean, your book is full of them. I don't even know where to start. Maybe you can just pick a couple and start sharing with us, because they're obviously heroes that we've never heard about.
They are, and I think that's the real legacy of all those who serve our country in uniform. They're almost all anonymous heroes, in my view, whether they serve for 2 years and then go on to become electricians and school teachers and insurance agency owners or whatever, or they become career officers. And that's what USS Midway America Shield's all about, is their oral history, their collection. This isn't a technical, detailed Navy lingo history book by any stretch. It's really the people of Midway, the young men of Midway. But to answer your question, there are so many that come to mind. I think about the young man in 1980 after Midway was accidentally rammed by a Panamanian freighter that caused a great deal of leaking jet fuel from the flight deck, who literally took it upon himself to lie underneath the planes up on the flight deck right above me, unhook 500-pound bombs with a buddy, pull them out from under the wing in a pool of jet fuel, manually pick them up and throw them over the side before a spark created a catastrophic explosion. He got a pat on the back, a letter in his personnel file, and he went back to work. Hearing him, talking to him years later, talk about that as if it were a paper cut, it's just remarkable to me. Another man was aboard this very ship in 1946 off the coast of Greenland, sub-freezing weather. Midway had been ordered to sail off the coast of Greenland to learn how to fly among the icebergs. World War II was a warm water war. And the worry then was World War III and Stalin and the Cold War was going to be started in Northern Europe, Scandinavia, and the Navy didn't know how to fly among the icebergs. Brutal conditions up there on the flight deck. Once it was over, Midway came back to New York City. The man started using eye drops. Still does today. The weather was so bad, the gear was so poor that the frostbite permanently froze or shut with scar tissue his tear ducts forever. And he's used, last time I talked with him, he was going on 60 years of eye drops without asking for any disability benefits, not asking for any recognition. That was just part of the job, he would tell me, and helping the Navy learn how to fly among the icebergs, literally back in 1946.
Wow.
Right behind me, 1975, April 30th, the fall of Saigon. Midway led the humanitarian mission there, rescuing more than 3,000 men, women, and children, very few men, grandfathers, in 24 hours. The young men on this ship took care of them up on the flight deck. They got them down below. They gave up their bunks so that brothers and sisters who were suddenly without parents, they were orphans who were left behind, had a place to sleep on their way to the unknown, which became the United States. That kind of courage, that kind of compassion, I think, is a hallmark of so many of the young men and women who serve our country through all the generations. And in researching the book, it came up time and time again, and it was a real privilege to include much of that in the book.
Let me take a quick break. We're talking to Scott McGaugh. He's authored a book, USS Midway, America's Shield, and Young Heroes at Sea. Let me encourage you to get a copy of that book. If you're watching the Dove TV, you saw a copy of it up there. This thing is really great, and it's a piece of history. And what an honor to be talking to Scott from the USS Midway. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back.
Follow the conversation. This is Afternoon on the Dove. Follow the conversation. This is Afternoon on the Dove.
Well, I've done a lot of interviews in 30 years of doing broadcasting. I got to tell you, this is one of the tops, and I am delighted and honored to have with us today Scott McGaugh, who is the marketing director of the USS Midway Museum. He is a award-winning author and veteran journalist for naval history, and he is literally talking to us today via Skype from the USS Midway, which is now a museum in San Diego. He has authored a book called USS Midway, America's Shield, Young Heroes at Sea, and there's a picture of it on the screen for you watching on the Dove TV. Let me encourage you to get a copy of this. It's put out by Pelican Press, and this is just a rich book full of great pictures and some great stories, and it's a piece of history, and what an honor to have him with us today. By the way, share this program with your friends. It'll be on the Dove TV again tonight at 6 and 10:30, and on the Dove Radio at 5, and then, of course, we'll have it up on the Dove website on a YouTube forum coming up in about an hour and a half. Scott, first of all, how is the museum open every day down there?
Yes, we're open every day, 10 to 5, except for Thanksgiving and Christmas. We've been open for 7 years now.
Okay. How dangerous was the flight deck?
It was extremely dangerous. You know, a lot of people don't realize, I certainly didn't, sitting on my couch at home watching Discovery Channel or History Channel programs about aircraft carriers, that when flight operations are taking place, there has to be a 30-knot wind going down the deck to enable planes to take off. So those young men, and today women, who are working on the flight deck are working in a 30-knot wind. They don't have a coffee pot or a couch or a chair nearby to take a break. Nearly all of the work they are doing is with hand signals because it's incredibly loud. It is incredibly dangerous on the flight deck. It is one of the most dangerous places in the world to work, although remarkably, over the 47 years of Midway's history, we've only been able to document 213 deaths, and a good number of those actually took place below the flight deck.
Wow. You know, what's so interesting about that, you're saying hand signals and everything else, but the ship then would would turn into the wind as well, so the ship's moving as well.
Oh, absolutely. There's always going to be some wave action. In fact, Midway was legendary for being a top-heavy ship on a narrow hull, heavy steel flight deck. So it was legendary for its rocking and rolling. In fact, some sailors called it the USS Rock and Roll for its propensity, so that it was always moving. If there was a 15-knot wind, the captain would turn the carrier into the wind and go 15 knots to make 30 knots down the deck to enable flight operations to take place. No matter what the sea state was, no matter what the weather was like at night, in the rain, that was the work environment for half a century up on the flight deck.
The reality is that once all of this to support the aircraft, once the aircraft were launched into battle, some didn't come back.
Oh, absolutely. One of the most poignant visitors I've had aboard, there have been a couple since Midway opened that come to mind. One of them, a man probably in his 60s now, he came aboard and I was taking him up to the flight deck. I know that he was an aviator on Midway during Vietnam. And he said, this is the first time I've been aboard since 1965, I think it was. And I said, oh? He said, yeah, it was right up here. And he walked up to the bow, and this is where I took off, and I never came back. And I asked him, so you landed ashore, you have engine trouble or whatever? He said, no, I was shot down and became a prisoner of war for 8 years. And didn't come home until 1973. And so it's been 40 years now, and I've always wanted to come back to the old girl and show my son and show my grandson where I took off in service to my country and became a POW. And it was at that point that the tears came. I stepped aside and allowed that family its private time and its private place.
It's unbelievable. Are you still bumping into veterans that are coming down to visit her?
Oh, all the time. Somewhat surprisingly, at least in the beginning, we of all the visitors who come aboard Midway, more than half are not veterans or veteran affiliated. It has a very broad interest level and appeal. But other than that, of course, we have many veterans who come aboard. We have many Midway former Midway sailors who come aboard, and they let it. And I'm sure many that we don't even know are former sailors. We've had former captains, admirals, bakers, cooks, electricians, and so on. Some of them were aboard during peace deployments. Others were aboard during Desert Storm. We have had men who have visited Midway as a museum who were members of the original crew in 1945. They literally have left a nursing home on their final trip in their life. And the one place they wanted to do, one place they wanted to go once they heard about it was come out to Midway in San Diego. And more often than not, they will turn to a family member and say, this is where I learned to become a man.
That's unbelievable, and that generation is quickly passing, if not almost extinct, from the original crew.
It is. The greatest generation is something that we are very mindful here. But because Midway served for half a century, while we honor the greatest generation, we certainly don't overlook the Cold War warriors, the Vietnam veterans, those who served all through the 70s and 80s, and certainly Desert Storm. With all due respect to each and every one of them, they're all equal in our eyes, and it's their collective legacy of courage and compassion and devotion and duty that we want to preserve and help inspire future generations to achieve a similar level of selflessness.
Tell us about the operations in Desert Storm. Where was the vessel, and how active was it during that time?
Midway was very active. It was 46 years old, the oldest in the fleet, smallest carrier in the fleet, and Admiral Dan March, who was in charge of all naval air operations, had his choice of any carrier in the fleet in which to base his office, his staff, his flag for his planning of naval air ops, and he chose Midway. Midway had such a record of accomplishment, of reliability, of finishing deployments for other carriers that broke down. He didn't want to have to worry about the ship that he was on. He needed to be on call, on duty, on station, no matter what was going to happen. So he chose Midway. Because of that, most of the naval air op planning that we all saw on CNN and elsewhere was planned on the level I'm sitting on right now on the other side of the ship. Midway, at such an advanced age, by the end of Operation Desert Storm, launched more aircraft per available aircraft per day than any other carrier in the fleet during Operation Desert Storm, and didn't lose a pilot. So even in its last combat mission as a very old carrier, not nuclear powered, it achieved a level, or maintained a level of performance that continued what had become known as Midway magic through the Navy. Again, a part of that legacy that we're here to preserve.
Did it ever get upgraded electronically? I mean, we know that the flight deck changed because of the aircraft through the times and the various decades, but did it ever get into the modern age of computers and things?
Oh, absolutely. It had to. Absolutely. It was a constant retrofit for Midway. Almost every time it came into port for any extended period of time, again, this ship was built before computers were invented. So as all that technology came along, from an aircraft tracking standpoint, from an aircraft navigation standpoint, communications, all that had to be retrofitted inside a floating steel honeycomb of 2,000 rooms. And so they were cutting through steel every 4 or 5 feet when they were running new lines, hundreds of miles of wiring, constantly retrofitting with each generation of new computers, of new technology, all the way up to 1991.
How many captains did it have in its history?
40. 40 captains in 47 years of service, but it was decommissioned for 6 of those years for overhaul. So technically 40 captains over the course of 41 years of active duty service on the sea.
Whoa. You ever bump into them?
Oh, yes. I've had the privilege of one of them, Captain Riley Mixon, is in the book. He is now a San Diego resident, a good friend of mine. Went on to play a key role in Desert Storm at the Pentagon. I've probably met 4 or 5 of the 40.
Wow. What an honor.
It is. I've met admirals, welcomed admirals aboard who had command of the battle group that was Midway, where they had their command. Admiral Dan March, as we just talked about, he's been aboard. He's come out to see Midway and has donated his flight jacket and some of his personal memorabilia to outfit his cabin, because as a museum only 7 years old, we're still restoring spaces and adding them to the public tour area. We still have 10 years of build out to go and adding to a self-guided audio tour that is narrated by those very same Midway sailors who lived or worked in each of those spaces.
You got any aircraft on board for the museum?
Well, yes, we do. We started off with 6, 7 years ago. I think we just welcomed our 25th aboard, a helicopter, a recently retired helicopter from the Navy. So our air wing right now stands at about 25 or 26. There are half a dozen other aircraft now in restoration, mostly by volunteers, a great part of the Midway Museum story. We'll get up to about 31, 32 aircraft in our air wing, and at that point we'll continue to restore additional aircraft and rotate them out from a maintenance standpoint. So we've got a pretty substantial air wing. All aircraft that flew off carriers, many of them actually flew off Midway itself.
And that's wonderful. Before we run out of time, I noticed in the book you do have quite a few very interesting pictures and articles or writings about some of the accidents on the flight deck, and too many to mention. But the flight deck, in addition to its normal being dangerous, it really saw a lot of action. Some planes that crashed on landing, things that went wrong. Maybe you can give us a little idea there.
Sure. I've interviewed and talked with a lot of flight deck personnel, from the officers in charge to the 20-year-old, 2 years out of high school, who was responsible, played a role in launching an aircraft or recovering an aircraft. And what really struck me was not so much the individual accidents, which were horrific. They were relatively rare, very rare, in fact. We know that Midway launched and recovered more than 300,000 planes in its over its career. Wow. And when you consider 200 deaths or so, and many of them below deck, the incident was rare. What they all told me was that was the danger, that it was so rare, that you would go days and weeks and hundreds and maybe even thousands of routine landings, and it would take just a split second of something going wrong, a lack of mental discipline, a mechanical breakdown, with no time to get out of the way, and suddenly you had a fireball on the flight deck, potentially consuming some portion of perhaps 100 men who were working there with no warning whatsoever. I think it was the uncertainty, the incredible degree of trust and teamwork and diligence that it took day after day after day in the middle of the ocean by 19 and 20-year-olds that made that possible. That while there were horrific accidents, they were extremely rare, especially considering the conditions that these young men work under.
Well, Scott, this has been fascinating. Let me just say to our viewers and our listeners, the book is called USS Midway. There it is on the screen, America's Shield, Young Heroes at Sea, Scott McGaugh. Let me tell you, and get a copy of this. It's put out by Pelican. I would assume, Scott, this is available Barnes & Noble. What's some of the other places you can get it, I guess? Amazon. Yeah.
Yes, bookstores can order it for you if they don't happen to have it on the shelf. It's available online in all the usual places. The museum has a website, and its online gift shop features that book and they're all autographed. So that's another option. But there are a lot of places to order it, either from your bookstore, your bookseller, or certainly online, or at midway.org.
What's next for the Midway? I got to let you go here in a second, but what's next for the Midway?
What's next for the Midway is the development of the Battle of Midway exhibit. It's going to be a state-of-the-art hologram, 4D, with sight, sound, smells, theater. That's going to be part of the admission. That is online for development 2013, perhaps 2014. That's going to be a major addition. We're in the planning stage right now.
Scott, thank you, my friend. What an honor. Can we get you back?
It's my pleasure. I would welcome the opportunity to share any more stories about those who protect our freedoms anytime you like.
And next time you're in Medford, give us a call. We'll have you live in the studio.
I will. Look forward.
Thank you. God bless you, my friend.
Thank you, Barry.
All right. And thank you for watching and listening. Again, you can see it again tonight on the Dove TV, 6 and 10:30. And get a copy of the book and share it with your family and friends. We'll see you tomorrow.